So the amazing thing to me about imposter syndrome is that you actually have to do a lot of really impressive things to qualify for it.
This episode is sponsored by Therapy Notes, therapynotes.com. Be sure and check them out and be sure and use the promo code Gordon, Gordon, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. Over 15 years ago, when I started my private practice, I had to learn a lot, and most of it the hard way, and I don't think you need to do the same. Hi, I'm Gordon Brewer, a licensed psychotherapist, and welcome to the Practice of Therapy podcast, part of the Psychcraft network of podcasts. Join me in this journey of discovery as we have conversations with other leaders and professionals in both the mental and allied health fields. Join us as we explore both the business and clinical sides of running a private practice. Hello, everyone. I'm Gordon Brewer, and this is episode number 309 of the Practice of Therapy podcast. Glad you joined me. I hope you're enjoying your holiday season. I guess we can say we're in the middle of it now, given that as this episode is coming out, we've only got like a week left till Christmas. And so it's coming fast. It seems like this year has just really been going by really quickly with the whole holiday season. And just, as I shared in previous episodes, I've been going through some things for me personally, just with grief and mourning. I lost my wife back at the beginning, right before Thanksgiving. And so still working through all of that. But as I said in a previous episode, I'm going to share more about that in a whole dedicated episode when I get ready to do that. But anyway, looking forward to you hearing my conversation with Jim LaPierre. And Jim is a therapist up in Maine. And we talk about this whole phenomenon of imposter syndrome. And that's something that gets thrown around a lot. I know when I was at the Wise Practice Conference back in October, there was one of the speakers, William Hemphill, that's the topic that he covered in that particular conference. But anyway, we do a little bit of a deep dive in this episode into imposter syndrome and how it affects us in our practices and the work that we do clinically. And hopefully you'll come away from this interview feeling better about yourself and feeling better about the work that you do. So listen in to this conversation with Jim, and we'll jump into that here in just a minute. But one of the things I'd like to invite you to do, one of the products that I've been talking about this month, and if you listen to last week's episode with Morgan Zients, we talk about the use of JotForm, which is a wonderful platform that helps you create customizable forms. And also a lot of people are using that whole platform to do a lot of their intake work with their practices. But you can go over to practiceoftherapy.com/jotform to find out more about that. And I would encourage you to go back and listen to the episode I did with Morgan. And I think you'll find it interesting. And to me, it's a really good tool to look at. And also real quickly here, before we get to my conversation with Jim, I'd love for you to hear a word from our sponsor of the podcast, Therapy Notes, and also one of the members of the Psychcraft network, of which this podcast is a member.
Hey there, Daniel Fava here, and if you don't know me, I'm the host of the Private Practice Elevation podcast, where I share online marketing strategies and interviews to help private practice owners attract more clients and scale their businesses. The Private Practice Elevation podcast is part of the Psychcraft network of podcasts, and I'm super excited to be a part of this network alongside Gordon and the great work he's doing. If you haven't discovered the Private Practice Elevation podcast yet, you can find it wherever you listen to your podcasts. I'd love for you to join me as we explore topics like building an effective website for your private practice, search engine optimization, content marketing, and copywriting, as well as my conversations with experienced private practice owners about scaling a practice, outsourcing, team leadership, and all things that will help you elevate your business and create the life you love. Be sure to check us out at privatepracticeelevation.com for resources and content to help you in your online marketing journey.
Have you ever wished your private practice could run as smoothly as a well-oiled machine? Well, look no further because Therapy Notes is here to revolutionize your practice. Therapy Notes is the complete practice management system you've been dreaming of. With everything you need to manage patient records, schedule appointments, meet with clients remotely, create rich documentation, and handle insurance billing, it's your secret weapon for a smoother practice. And the best part? It's accessible wherever and whenever you need it. Yep, even on the go. Imagine having more time for what truly matters, your clients. It's like having an extra set of hands, but digital. And here's the kicker. It's the very EHR Gordon relies on in his own practice. So, you know it's the real deal. Say goodbye to paperwork nightmares and hello to more time and better quality care. Check out Therapy Notes today at practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes. Oh, and don't forget to use the promo code GORDON to get 2 months free. That's practiceoftherapy.com/therapynotes with the promo code GORDON. Enjoy the show.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome again to the podcast. And I'm happy for you to get to know today Jim LaPierre. Welcome, Jim.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Yes, so Jim is an LCSW and is located in Maine, and is really kind of his forte is working with other clinicians on imposter syndrome, which is something that comes up a lot for all of us, as we were just kind of chatting briefly about before we started recording. I know it's something that I struggle with all the time. But Jim, as I start with everyone, why don't you tell folks a little bit more about yourself and how you've landed where you've landed?
Wow, how I landed here is a loaded question, as I think it is for all healers and helpers. I started out as a clinician to become the person who would have helped me as a child, as an adolescent, as an adult. I think we all obviously have personal reasons for going into these fields. But my bias is that a lot of us are so eager to help others that we don't necessarily fully attend to our own healing. And so that has certainly been true. I think starting out in therapy as a client, I found that my motivation for going and getting help for myself was that I was afraid of how I might unwittingly harm my clients. And I wish that I had done it just for myself, but that was not the case. And so the best thing about being a clinician to me is that I hate being a hypocrite. I have to practice all of the things that I preach, and attending to my ongoing healing and growth has been the key to my success in everything that I've done professionally.
Yeah. I fully agree. And I think, as people have heard from me on this podcast, if we're not doing our own work, we're working on our own internal stuff. I know for me, one of the best things I do every month is meet with my therapist. And so it's a good thing.
It's a necessary thing. And I think it takes a lot to come to acceptance of that. I went into the field understanding what vicarious and secondary trauma were, what compassion fatigue was. But honestly, I believe myself immune to all of those things. And of course, I tell my clients that I'm a slow learner with a high pain tolerance. So I seem to need to learn the same lessons over and over again. And I burned out multiple times in the early years of my career. I worked in very toxic community mental health settings and had to come to terms with some very difficult things. But my specialty throughout my career has been working with survivors of trauma. And the biggest adjustment that I had to make early on was recognizing that intuitively, the folks that I was working with had the ability to read me like a book. And
Mm-hmm.
so they knew if I was giving advice that I don't take, and had to dig deep and look at the expectations and the standards that I held myself to and the support that I wasn't seeking. And I've done a place where not only was I struggling with imposter syndrome, I was doing way too much and seemed to believe that this is what was necessary. And it took me a long time to realize that what I was doing professionally was the same thing I did in my family of origin. I internalized the expectations of authority figures and about and set up. So it has taken a lot of painful lessons, but my goal in doing clinical supervision, in teaching, and in writing is to me and others can learn from every mistake I've ever.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think, one of the things that I've learned in working with clients, kind of you mentioned clients being able to see right through stuff. I think what I've learned is that you're a much more effective clinician when you can be a little bit vulnerable with clients, a little bit of self-disclosure and letting them know that, okay, yeah, I get it. I struggle with some of the same things. I think it just gives us more, not validation, but gives us more, I'm losing the word now, but gives us more credibility is the word I was looking for. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so. So, yeah. So as you think about imposter syndrome, how do you define that and how do you see it? Because I think it's kind of become a buzz, kind of a buzz cliche or phrase that we throw around a lot, but I think a lot of people see it in different ways.
So the amazing thing to me about imposter syndrome is that you actually have to do a lot of really impressive things to qualify for it. So if your experience is anything like mine, you had to survive your family of origin and all the traumas that went with it. You had to survive middle school, high school. You had to earn an undergraduate degree, do a bunch of internships, and complete graduate school, all so that you could feel like a fraud. And I think that that is the norm. I think it's what everyone experiences, at least early on in their career. And so today, when I teach clinicians in training, one of the very first things I say to them is if no one has told you yet, you are supposed to be terrified. It is
Mm,
absolutely normal. We are doing incredibly important and sacred work. And so to feel like you're somehow eminently qualified to do this is not reality. We need
right.
to give ourselves permission to be new to something. We need to catch ourselves comparing because when we're coming from a place of fear or insecurity, we tend to compare ourselves to others, and that comparison is always invalid. We
Right.
also need to we also need to recognize that imposter syndrome is not specific to a particular role, and that's the biggest misconception we have about it. So there's
Mhm.
two parts to this. The first part is I experienced imposter syndrome as a new clinician, but I also experienced it as a new program manager, as a new clinical supervisor, as a new executive director. Each time I experienced it for shorter periods of time, I came to be familiar with, okay, I'm in a new role and I'm adjusting and I need to give myself patience and grace. But every time there was a big change, I experienced the same thing. And so
Mhm.
what I've come to believe is that the key to overcoming imposter syndrome is to make huge investments in getting comfortable with ourselves, in our identities, in continuing to heal our wounds. And I see those as the most important things we can do to overcome. Because all of the feelings of being a fraud or a chameleon, those existed for most of us long before we ever entered the fields professionally. So the key
Mhm.
is not getting good at the job. The key is getting comfortable with yourself.
Right, right. As you were saying that, one of the things I was kind of reflecting on is I think there's this phenomenon in our education system. I mean, and I'm speaking more specifically to graduate programs, and I'm not saying this all are like this, but one of the messages that I think gets handed to people, which I think is not a good message, is that until you've gotten a certain level of experience, you could probably do some harm to people. Now, I just don't know that that's true. I think, like you, Jim, working with people, supervising people through the licensure process and that sort of thing, that is one of their big fears, is that, oh, I'm gonna mess this up. I'm not experienced enough. I'm not this enough, or whatever, fill in the blank enough. But I think you're right. We've all been there, and it is terrifying when you sit down with clients for the first time, or you get faced with, maybe a situation that you've not really dealt with before, but being able to boost that confidence that you do have what you need, and it's just a matter of accessing it.
I think the first 2 years that I worked as a therapist, I silently prayed to everybody listening, please don't let them realize I have no idea what I'm doing. I honestly, I have a bias about most of what we think of in terms of graduate school and training to become a professional, which is that I think so much of what we do is meant to safeguard the liability of the employer, not the clinician, and not even necessarily the client.
Yes.
What we can do that would do harm to a client are things that we would never do, and they're things that we take advantage of ourselves, take for granted. If you were going to harm a client, you could do so by being homophobic, by being racist, by being sexist. And so one of the most important things I think to do in preparation to becoming a clinician is to really delve deep and learn about yourself. What are your biases? What are your prejudices? And maybe they're not at the extreme of any of the isms, but maybe they're things in the earliest part of my career. I did a little bit of harm because I was working with an adolescent who simply could not imagine graduating high school and wanted to drop out and study for a GED. And my bias was that, of course, he should finish high school. And I did some harm there because I wasn't open to his pathway of success initially. I came around, but not knowing that I had a bias. In retrospect, it was obvious. I have a bias in favor of education. Of course I do. I'm a highly educated person. But that was a disservice to my client. So am I going to harm a client because I said the wrong thing? No. And one of the worst things about being a new clinician is that you critique yourself and you play back each session in your head, and you think, well, should I have said that? Should I have said it then? Should I have said it that way? And it's a great way to drive yourself nuts. It's way too much pressure.
Yeah.
So the biggest disservice that we do in training clinicians is we hammer the idea of professionalism. And so much of what we call professionalism actually means be disingenuous. Don't be vulnerable. Don't be a real person. And that is, I think, the biggest harm that we do, because it perpetuates the feeling of being a fraud.
Right. Yeah, and I think where we can go wrong, and I think what this is maybe the silver lining to imposter syndrome, because I think about maybe the opposite of that is maybe a little bit of hubris, where a person is a little bit arrogant about their ability. And we've run into folks like that. And I think that's where people can be of more danger to folks. Danger might be the strong word, but be more harmful to folks in what we do.
100% agree. And my experience is that when folks are arrogant, it's almost always the case that they're overcompensating because they're scared and they're hiding.
Right.
So I say better to be transparent. I practice therapy with a lot of vulnerability. And I really, if I was going to attribute my success as a therapist to anything, I would say it's my willingness to muddle, my willingness to be 100% in the moment with no plan and making things up as we go. Yeah. The idea that we're supposed to be an expert is something that I strenuously object to, is that casts your client in a passive role in which they're just supposed to somehow benefit from my benevolent wisdom. And what I would prefer in all cases is that therapy be a mutual process where we're doing this together, not just helping the client find their own truth, but actually defining the process together about what works for them.
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the greatest qualities that we can have as therapists is learning how to be just compassionately curious with clients, being able to really understand their world and approach it from a place of curiosity and caring, and being able to being able to convey that with folks.
100% agree. And then I think the counterintuitive piece is to continue to be curious about ourselves, because this work changes you.
Yes.
As you bear witness, especially in bearing witness to suffering. I realized a long time ago that because of my specialty, I was either going to grow spiritually or I was going to gradually lose my hope for humanity. I was going to gradually find myself cynical and jaded, and I didn't want any of that. So learning about myself and how doing this work affects me, therapy is hard on a good day. This job was hard long before COVID. This job was hard because it's draining. It is the only place in the world where a completely non-reciprocal relationship is still healthy. And I don't hear often people talk about the cost of doing this work and how the need to be replenished and rejuvenated is ongoing.
Right.
We typically only talk about that in terms
of... You're muted, Jim.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah. So, yeah, you were talking about continuously need to something.
Continuously replenishing, rejuvenating. We give lip service to ideas like peer support and the value of clinical supervision. We talk about self-care, and I think for most of us, our definition of what self-care is very limited. Self-care was only an idea. It was never something that I practiced. It was something that I knew was important, but I had all of these clients and all of the volunteer activities and all of these people in my life. And everything about my conditioning growing up is that other people's needs are important and mine are not. And so I just continuously became drained, continuously burned out. And I have been very fortunate. I've worked with a lot of folks in recovery from substance use disorder, and I've been able to apply everything that 12 programs extol to my own life. And so I got sick and tired of being sick and tired. And then and only then did I actually put down on paper, okay, here are all of the things that I'm doing. Here are my expectations and the standards I'm holding myself to. And this is insane. This can't be done. So self-care became not only something that I practice, but it literally is scheduled in my book every week, because I have proven over and over and over again that if I don't make commitments to myself, I will never follow through with them.
Right. Yeah. And I know that that's something that most of us, at least I know that's something that's constantly a work in progress for myself, is just being able to pay attention to that self-care in whatever form that takes. I think everybody has to kind of find their way as far as what self-care looks like for them. But I think one of the things is being able to have the off switch there. In other words, not always being on for people, being able to set boundaries around your work, and doing those things that recharge your batteries.
I always urge clinicians to have hobbies and interests that have absolutely nothing to do with what we do professionally, because if you're not careful, there's always important advocacy work to be done. And there's always directors that I could be sitting on, or some volunteerism that would make an impact in my community. Therapy is, for me, is progressively a lifestyle. It has this ongoing effect on every relationship that I have. And so having outlets outside of the field has really been key for me to
Hmm.
have things to look forward to engage in activities that really are totally unrelated to what I do professionally.
Right, right. Yeah, and I totally agree. I think that's something that's just being able to have, yeah, I think the other part of that is just having a community around you where you're not isolating yourself with all the stuff that we get handed. I think, one of the one of the cornerstones of the therapy world is confidentiality and being able to, be able to hold things in confidence, but it's like you're carrying around all these secrets for people. But I think there comes a time, going back to what you said earlier about vicarious trauma, there comes a time when you need to have a community where you can process those things and talk about how it's affecting you. And I think that's, even though I think a lot of times too, for those of us that are, been doing it a while, and even though we've been licensed a while, doing supervision and having groups that you can talk to about those things is real important.
Absolutely. And it's so vital to have that. And in the early years of my career, I was working in particularly toxic workplaces, and there's nothing about that type of leadership or environment that's conducive to opening up and sharing with other clinicians, here are the places that I'm struggling, because those types of environments foster competition as opposed to collaboration.
Mm-hmm.
And you're never quite sure who's safe up and share and just say, look, I'm really struggling.
Yeah.
Particularly with vicarious and secondary trauma, I've needed to have people who I appreciate that they hold space for me. I appreciate that they're compassionate. What I often need is somebody to call me out on my blind spots, on the
Mm-hmm.
things that I'm not able to see or not willing to see. And my experience is you have to be fairly secure in yourself as a person and as a clinician to have a willingness to call people out. And
Right.
it's one more lesson that I learned from working with people in recovery from substance use disorder is that so often the addictive mind is everything about it is self-deception. Everything is minimization, rationalization, and justification. And so
Mm-hmm.
I started learning about the ways in which we deceive ourselves. And of course, for people like me, the biggest lie to tell ourselves is I'm fine, I'm okay.
Mm-hmm.
And even
Mm-hmm.
when I'm not, then I tell myself I am.
Right.
So have patients in my life who we just are very open about this and say, look, if you see me struggling, if you see me getting defensive or not following through on the things that I need to be doing, please tell me in no uncertain terms. And I'm very fortunate to have a number of folks like that in my life today. But early in my career, that was a hard thing to ask for, and it was a hard thing to find.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, Jim, I've got to be respectful of our time here, but in your time especially. And I want you to tell folks a little bit about your book on imposter syndrome. And yeah, just tell us a little more about that.
Overcoming Imposter Syndrome for Healers and Helpers is actually my third book. And I am really at heart a storyteller. I don't have a lot of clinical jargon or anything analytical for you. What I have is my own experience and the mistakes that I made along the way so that hopefully others can learn from them. And what I've presented is my experience of probably 8 or 9 of the clinicians that I worked with over the years and kind of sharing their journeys as well, and how each of us struggles in ways that are connected. The things that we struggle with as clinicians tend to be connected to things that we have struggled with personally, whether that's related to our own trauma, related to being an adult child of an alcoholic or addict. Whatever the
Mm-hmm.
connection is, we have to find that and we have to continue to heal that wound so that we can feel whole. Honestly, I think too many of us feel an emptiness, feel broken, and we're trying to help other people out of the same boat. And that all of that fuels imposter syndrome, because who the hell am I to be dispensing this advice if I'm
Mm-hmm.
struggling with depression, if I'm struggling with anxiety?
Yeah.
And so whenever I meet or teach, the very first thing that I want folks to know about me is that I identify as a wounded healer. I'm not in this field because I'm so altruistic that I can't get through a day without helping somebody. I have the joy of working with people who are very much like me. And people who are like me are people who live with mental illness, or people who live with eating disorders or self-harm or substance use disorders. And so in all of the work that I've done, I guess the point that I would stress the most is that I have made it a point to learn from every single person that I've served. And I'm happy to share those stories as well in my writing. And my hope is that anecdotally, folks can make some connections to themselves. They can recognize that so much of what we've been taught about how to do this work is really not genuine, it's really not vulnerable. And my hope is that we continue to attend to our own growth and healing so that we become more effective. And I think that's the key. If it was only for my benefit, I might never have invested so heavily in further therapy for myself in so many of the ways in which I've sought healing. But as soon as I realized that it was going to directly benefit my clients, then it wasn't just a nice idea, it was a responsibility. It was something that I needed to do. And I think it's one of the common themes amongst healers and helpers of all types is that no matter what our experience, all of us want to be optimally effective at the work that we do. And I suppose it's a bit counterintuitive, but the most important aspect of that and the most important thing that you bring to therapy is yourself. So my hope is that folks will invest heavily in their continued healing. And I always welcome connections. So if folks are reading any of my stuff or seeing me on social media, please know that I would love to hear from you. Counseling@roadrunner.com is the easiest way to do that. And if I can be a resource, I would love to be.
Awesome. And we'll have links in the show notes and the show summary for folks to be able to connect, and that way they can get in touch with you. Well, Jim, I'm so glad we had this conversation, because I think it's something that, even though I've talked about this topic a few times on the podcast, but I think it's always good to revisit. And hopefully people that are listening might also find this a bit reassuring, and that the work that we do as counselors and therapists and social workers is very noble. And I like to even say, go out on a limb here and say it's holy work. And so, And so I think it's important for us to continue to do what we need to do to take care of ourselves and really recognize that we do this important work.
Absolutely.
So, well, thanks, Jim, and hope we can have another conversation here soon. Well, a big thanks to Jim for being on the podcast, and hope this has given you some good things to think about in terms of just maybe how your own imposter syndrome maybe holds you back a little bit in your clinical work, and also just your confidence. So, it was a great conversation, and thanks to Jim for being on the podcast. I do apologize for a little bit of the audio quality. We were having trouble with our internet connections, and so it wasn't quite as good as I'd like for it to be, but hopefully you got to hear it all without any trouble. And also, before you go, be sure and check out Jot forms. And if you'll go over to practiceoftherapy.com/Jot forms, you can check them out. Jot form is a wonderful platform that I'm using a lot of their forms and that sort of thing, and particularly with the practice of therapy. And I've used it also within my practice in different capacities, but be sure and check it out. I think you might find it interesting, and it might be a good tool for you in your practice. And also a big thanks to our sponsor of the podcast, Therapy Notes. Couldn't do without them. They are the leading electronic health record system for mental health providers. Use them in my practice, and we could not operate without them. And they're constantly adding to their platform and coming out with a lot of great tools within the platform and assessments and that sort of thing. So it's a really good platform to use. But be sure to check it out by going to practiceoftherapy.com/therapy notes. And use that promo code Gordon, just GORDON, and you can try them out for 2 months for free. So be sure and check them out. And coming up next week will be our last episode of the year, and you're going to get to hear from Brian Dixon, and that was a great interview with him. And so I'm looking forward to you hearing from Dr. Brian Dixon in our next episode. And do take care, folks. Take time to follow us or subscribe to the podcast wherever you might be listening to it. And I really appreciate you and being part of this whole private practice world and the practice of therapy community. So take care, folks. You've been listening to the Practice of Therapy podcast with Gordon Brewer, part of the PsychCraft network of podcasts. You can find out more about the other great podcasts in the network by visiting psychcraftnetwork.com. And if you haven't done so already, please visit us at practiceoftherapy.com and get your free private practice startup guide, along with a lot of other great resources and webinars and free things just by visiting. Also, be sure to follow us wherever you might be listening to your podcasts. This podcast is intended to be educational in purpose and is not intended to give legal, accounting, or counseling advice. If you need a professional, find the right person for that.